Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of hope to raise faithful kids. I'm Tony Kolenc, a father of five, a homeschooling columnist, law professor, and the author of the Harwood Mysteries fiction series for teens. On that note, here in the season of Lent, I've been enjoying doing classroom visits to middle schools across the nation, from New Jersey to California. Please go to my website, antonykolenc.com, if you want to schedule me to come talk to your school's religion, history, or literature class about writing, about the hero's journey, about the Middle Ages. On today's show, we'll be speaking with Andrea Bear, author of The Grieving Daughters Club, about how to help families handle grief and loss in their lives. My guest today is Andrea Bear, a high school history teacher and author. In 2018, she lost her mother to cancer, and she began to channel her grief and her faith through writing, which led to the publication of articles in such faith-based websites as CatholicMom.com. And now she even has out her debut novel, Grieving Daughters Club, and she's working on a sequel to that. She and her husband, Kevin, live in California with their three daughters. Andrea, welcome to the Shepherd's Pie.
Hi, Tony. Thanks so much for having me on here. This is exciting.
And it's great to have you. And I know we're going to be talking about kind of a sensitive subject today. Whenever we're talking about grief, so many people have lost loved ones, family members, and friends. But before we kind of start peeling that onion back, I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, because you've got an interesting background.
So I'm a history teacher. I teach at an early college high school. I teach AP European history and world history. And my mom died in 2018. She had brain cancer. I had taken care of her for the years prior to that. And when she passed, it really put me into kind of a frozen place, meaning that I was a person that was very active. I still am an active person, but I found that I just couldn't operate in the same manner. And grief has a way sometimes of locking you up from the things that you do in a normal situation, and you somehow just can't seem to kind of persevere. I tried to get back onto my regular schedule, and it was difficult to do that. And I found that writing was a haven because I could channel some of my thoughts, my grief. I felt like I was bothering people with the way that I felt because, you know, after someone passes, there's a period where people reach out and they're sympathetic, and then that time passes, but you're still left with all of these things that you kind of have to figure out. I didn't want to be stuck with this feeling. And I noticed when you do share that, a lot of people come at you with trying to cover it up, you know, warm fuzzies, it'll be okay. And I didn't really want that. I needed to figure out how to move forward, and I had no idea how to do this. So I started writing, and I had gone to a women's conference, ran into an old friend of mine who was one of the speakers at the conference. I had no idea she was even speaking. She was also a writer. She did blogs for Christian websites. And something just kind of sparked inside of me. Now, I truly believe that was the Holy Spirit kind of igniting this flame in me. And I reached out to her, and I just thought, you know, maybe I could do that. So it took me about 6 months to finally get the courage to submit anything. But once I did, a local radio station actually reached out to me. They saw my article and started interviewing me. And I think that was confirmation that I was supposed to do this. So I started doing bigger projects. I started writing for other, websites. And then I joined the Catholic Writers Guild. I met a bunch of wonderful people, and I noticed they were working on all these different projects, and I wanted to write something bigger. I felt like I needed a purpose to continue, but I didn't feel qualified to preach to anyone and tell them how to navigate their grief. I didn't feel qualified in any particular area. So what I did is I took my experience and I took the people around me in my life, and I started to write in a fictional manner. So at the time of my mom's passing, I belonged to this Bible study of these wonderful women. They were a great support system, all going through different experiences, not necessarily loss in terms of death, but losses of other ways of their life. Putting all of that together, I decided to come up with this story. And I found as I was writing it, even though it was very loosely based on these women, it became a support and it became a form of healing for me. And that's how Grieving Daughters Club came to be. I have received a lot of great feedback, and not necessarily from friends. So I tend to think that even on my first shot, it turned into something that's been very helpful to people.
That's great. And I definitely want to hear more about the premise of the book and all that. But something you said a minute ago, I thought was worth dwelling on. When you're going through grieving and you have a loss, and you even mentioned it might not even be a death. Our family went through a loss with an adoption situation with one of my grandchildren. But, after about a year, some folks would say even like, oh, you're still thinking about that. And people don't always understand how long grief can continue. So I'm interested. So the idea of being able to channel your grief through your writing, can you talk a little bit more just about that process before we get to your book?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would first start by saying, there's no timeline for grief, no matter what kind it is. I think it's all very personal, depending on the relationship that you have with the person or the experience. Grief is really love, it's unplaced love, and trying to navigate what to do with that love when that person or that experience no longer exists. And so for me, writing became an outlet. I never thought of myself as a writer, but I found writing was very therapeutic. I could be my own audience. It didn't even have to make sense. It didn't have to be a complete sentence. It just needed to be a place where I could leave it and come back to it whenever I needed to. And that's what I found so beautiful about writing. Anyone can do this. You don't have to be qualified. I look at Jesus and I look at the parables that he shared, trying to connect with people. And I think that's where this story started to come together. So my story is based around the women who I had this Bible study with. And again, it's loosely based. Not all of the things that happened to them in the story are accurate. But the character Frankie Waters, she lost her mom. It's been 2 years since her mother's passed. And her family has told her, your quote unquote time for grieving is over and we need you to move on. Typically, most people give about a year. So having 2 years, her family was like, okay, how much longer is this going to last? So she decides to join a church group, and she really doesn't want to go, but she does it to show faith to her family that, she's trying in all efforts to move forward. And I think in grief, sometimes we don't always get the opportunity to grieve the way we'd like. So she moves forward. And in the process, she ends up meeting some really wonderful people. She also realizes that their experiences have changed them, and she becomes involved in their lives and starts helping them. And she finds that this actually serves as a form of healing. And I think the biggest takeaway of this story is that she doesn't leave this group saying, oh, I'm done grieving. It's over. I don't think you really ever finish that. The loss never goes away because the love never goes away. But you also learn how to channel that love. And that's really how this story kind of came to be.
Well, it sounds like a beautiful story. And you said that this is actually going to be a 3-part series. Are you following the same characters through future areas of their lives?
Yes. And part of the reason I decided to do it in 3 is because people grieve in different ways. And I didn't want this character to be like the pinnacle of how a person should go through. I know that when I lost my mother, my brother and I grieve very differently. My father grieved very differently. And the relationship of a spouse, losing a spouse, or losing a parent, my children grieve differently for my mother. So the series will kind of showcase some of the different ways in which people process and their relationships. I'm sure many of your viewers, if they've gone through an experience, they're familiar with the stages of grief. So this will kind of showcase in these next few chapters and how Frankie navigates her own while also helping some of the others who will experience forms of loss.
The fact that you chose a 3-part series makes me think that you see at least 3 ways that are different from each other. What are the 3 ways that you're kind of demonstrating in your books?
So my first book really kind of caters the avoidance. Frankie Waters, the main character, she has isolated herself from people. She has lost a lot of friendships and acquaintances because she has removed herself. She's been so depressed. She stopped going to activities and, functions. And so now she's trying to bring herself out of that, as we call it, a cocoon of grief. The second book is really going to address more of the anger, the denial, and the bargaining. And everyone goes through these. They maybe go through them at different points in their experience. And so the second book really is more about just recognizing it's okay to be angry. It's okay to question. It's okay to even avoid or deny. I think those are all very normal steps in the process. But as I mentioned before, at some point you have to face it. That's what the second book's going to be about. And then the third book is still kind of transforming, but it's really more of kind of the finale of our place is in heaven with God. And when we recognize that this is really just a journey to get there, then we look at our losses much differently than we do looking at them as so permanent. That's what I hope to point out in these three parts.
So that's a good segue, I think, into this idea of families handling grief. What are your initial thoughts on when they have a major loss in their family?
I have come to learn that grief is not something that you should rush. It shouldn't be forced. And how people grieve, they're going to go through it differently. Some people keep busy. Some people, like myself, we journaled. Others cry. Some try to avoid it. I will say that it's okay to go with any of those manners. However, if you do avoid grief for too long, it will catch up to you. So it does need to be addressed at some point. And in terms of that timeline, I think that is very personal to the person, to the situation, to the relationship, to the person that's been lost. When my mother died, my children were very close with her. My youngest, of course, doesn't have as many memories as my two older ones. But what we did is we wrote letters. That is also really helpful. So like my journaling, writing letters. I also allowed my children to, talk candidly anytime they wanted to. I tried not to force my own grief on them because my relationship with my mother is going to be different than the relationship that they had. I tried not to downplay their feelings as well, because I think it's very easy to say, well, in a family, well, I love this person more than you did. And I think that can really kind of hinder a person's experience and loss. The other thing that we've done, and being a Christian, we recognize that this is not the end. And I think it's really important for us to celebrate that this is temporary, that we will see our loved ones again. So whenever we come across my mom's anniversary dates, birthday, her passing, we go to the cemetery. My mom loved coffee. We bring a coffee to her headstone. We celebrate with a dessert that my mom would have liked. I'd also try to share with my children that I'm not going to just stay in this place, that we have to move forward. So I try to do like a good gesture to somebody. Usually I buy a couple people in line at the coffee shop a drink on behalf of my mom. And so that shows my children that it's not just about their life. It's about the legacy of carrying that forward. And, we are all brothers and sisters of Christ, that we are still called to serve. Our life isn't over. And we still have a job to do, and that is to live and walk like Jesus did.
I'm wondering if you can maybe separate, because you said you have younger kids and then older kids. Maybe let's take them in turn. Do you have some suggestions that you think might be helpful to try as a family if you've got older teenagers in particular, and you've got a loss in the family, how to help them process that the best?
My older children, well, my mom has been gone close to 5 years now. So my oldest is 17, which would have put her at about 12 years old when my mom passed. And I had a friend that came over and had my girls pick out a top that was of my mom's, and she made bears out of them. So they still have these dolls today, and they're made in the clothing of my mom's. And that was really helpful. In fact, my girls still today have these dolls. I think my youngest may still sleep with hers. but those are special. They know that those are treasures. So having something that's significant that your children maybe want to keep, a keepsake, that's a great way to honor our loved ones. And it depends on your family. But, for me, I'm Catholic, saying a novena in honor of our loved ones. This reminds our children, like I said before, this isn't the end, that we're going to see them and they're intercessors. They are prayers for us in heaven. That has been really helpful.
The making stuffed animals out of the clothing, that's a beautiful idea. My wife lost her brother in his 30s, actually, but he used to collect Hard Rock Cafe shirts. And after his death, her mom and her basically had a giant quilt made of all these Hard Rock Cafe t-shirts. And
I
it
love
does.
it.
It's just a great way to remember and honor the person, something that they loved. What about younger kids?
I think if we're looking at our younger children versus our older children, allowing them to take the lead, I think that helps as well, because I think if we just force all of this on our kids, they may not be ready. I know in the first couple months after my mom died, life was a kind of a fog and it was a blur. There's actually been studies that say that the body goes into this kind of protection mode when you've experienced a great devastating loss. And so it's kind of what they call flight or fight. For me, I couldn't remember a lot of the things that were happening around me. I just had this brain fog. I didn't try to fight it. I tried to just kind of clear my schedule. I think we are kind of trained in our society that having every experience become pleasant is easier to get through things. And if your kids are crying about someone that they've lost, allow them that experience. And I would say validate that. That must be really hard for you. I can totally see why you'd be hurting inside. That's okay. So I think, and that's not something that you necessarily have to do for teenagers or for younger children. I think everybody wants to acknowledge that those experiences are difficult. So I think just letting your kids know that you're there for them. Don't try to fill their schedule. That sometimes can actually be hindering because you're delaying the process. One thing that is great, especially if you find that children need some kind of tangible thing, writing a letter and tying it to a balloon and then sending it up into the sky, because then it becomes that sense that, this is going to get to them in heaven. I think that's beautiful for young children, even for adults. I think would be a great way to allow children to heal.
That is beautiful. All right. So you mentioned faith, but I'm going to ask you something a little different about faith, because I think especially when people get a loss that they weren't expecting in their lives, the reaction might be that anger at God, or, why would God even allow this to happen? And to some people, maybe to a lot of people, it could become a challenge to their faith, and especially to kids who are still in a formative stage. What are your thoughts on helping kids to kind of keep the faith even as they're going through this loss?
Dealing with loss and questioning why a person has left can be very difficult, especially for children, especially even for adults. I'm fortunate our family has a faith-based background, because that really helps to understand the process. So I think leaning on our faith is really important. If God can put his own son through an insane amount of suffering, die and resurrect, how are we any different than being able to go through pain and suffering? Again, I'm going to speak only from my own experience, but I never questioned my mom's passing, primarily because I truly believe God had her do everything that she was meant to do in this life. Now, I'm not saying my mom was a saint and everything in her life was perfect. We all go through ups and downs. But I truly believe God puts people in our lives so that we can become the person we're called to be. So when we lose someone, it's very oftentimes questioned, why? Why did God give this person cancer? Why did this person go? They died so early, they died so young, or, why did they take grandma? She had a full life. We don't tend to question when they're older. We tend to question when they're younger. My goal is, I'd like to share with my children is that God has a plan for each of us that none of us really fully know. And we just have to trust in that plan. It's kind of like when you're giving your children too much candy and they love the candy, but you know that vegetables are definitely better for them. So sometimes they have to have the vegetables, even though they don't taste so great, but you know that's going to help them in the process. And so grief is kind of like that too. There's going to be hard moments, there's going to be difficulty. And God puts those vegetables in our place sometimes because he knows that they're going to help us down the road for something that's probably so much sweeter. Don't give up hope, especially if you don't know the answers. We're not meant to know all the answers. And I would say that if you're hurting, if you're going through a portion of pain, a simple prayer asking God to put the right people into your life to help you explain, help to guide you, to comfort you. And I truly believe that day that I met my friend who was a writer, I think that was an answer to my prayers, because there wasn't anyone in my life at that time that could really help me through this process. My husband's a wonderful, loving, supportive man. That wasn't his job though. And my children, it wasn't their job to do that. So God sends messengers into our life to help us navigate and get through those hard times.
And one of the beautiful things you just were talking about is relating things back to God and Jesus, and how God is not ignorant to suffering because Jesus experienced a lot of suffering. And I know in a moment we're going to be talking in our entertainment segment about Saint Joseph. And as you were talking about Jesus suffering, I was thinking, tradition seems to say that Saint Joseph probably died when Jesus was a lot younger in his life. And so I'm thinking Jesus even would have had to experience the loss of his foster father in his life. And that somehow is a comforting thought sometimes, to know that, God went through the same kind of loss that we might go through in our lives.
Yeah, you're right. And we don't hear about Joseph when Jesus was in his ministry. And we can imagine that, he had to see his foster father pass. He had to experience the loss that his mother had to endure. He's fully human, and he experienced every emotion that you and I experience today. And so, if anything, that's very comforting to know that God is not a God that just says, here, figure it out. He empathizes with us. He is there with us in the hard moments, but he does allow us to experience those hardships. And I think that's the part a lot of people struggle with, is I'm kind of at my wit's end. Someone said to me a long time ago, God only gives you so much that you can handle. Well, that's false. God sometimes gives you more than you can handle so that you can lean on him, and that he will take some of that burden from you. And I've always remembered that. So especially when you feel like your plate is way too full, he's going to take on the rest of that for you, but you have to be open to allowing him to.
That's wonderful. And this discussion about St. Joseph is actually a really nice segue into our entertainment segment. And then we'll finish up with some final thoughts from you after that. In each episode of The Shepherd's Pie, I like to ask my guests if they have a book or movie that they would recommend for families or teens or kids. Andrea, what have you brought us today?
I have recently come across a book series, and it's just began. It's called Adventures with the Saints. And the first book to come out is actually none other than St. Joseph. And the book talks about St. Joseph's experience as a foster father to Jesus. And what I love about this story is it's written in a way for children to really understand the role of St. Joseph, that while Jesus is the Son of God, Joseph played a very significant role in Jesus's life, modeling to him what a father is like, what a man is like. And so this is a story that I would definitely recommend. It's by Maria Riley. She is an author in the Florida area. She has a series of books that are going to be coming out on different saints and their lives. And so this would be my recommendation for your readers to pick up.
And what age range would you recommend this for?
I think this is perfect for probably 8 to 12-year-old readers. This is ideal for somebody who is just learning about the saints, but wants to do it in a less theological way. And it's really connects with the personal everyday to day experiences that saints go through. He's high up there in our saint list.
Absolutely. All right. And so that's Maria Riley, Adventures with Saints, and Saint Joseph, the foster father of Jesus. Speaking of age ranges, I meant to ask you about your Grieving Daughters Club books. What age range would you recommend? Are those really just for adults or older teens?
I do recommend it more for adults. Mature teens, I think, depending on your family, there are experiences in there that deal with loss in terms of like a person that might encounter the possibility of an abortion. There is an experience in there with people who are coping with loss, but not necessarily in the healthiest way. So there is some material that I think is, depending on your age group, is questionable, but I think anywhere from ages 16 and up would be appropriate.
Final question then. You've already given us a lot of great ideas and advice, but if you're talking to a parent or a teacher, youth minister, somebody who is dealing with a kid who has had a loss in their lives, final bit of advice that you might give to them on dealing with that child?
Just let them know you're there for them. You don't have to fix their problems. Grief is long term. It's not going to go away overnight. So just letting them know that you're there, that in itself is really helpful. Pray for that child. That really helps along the way because it's going to allow God to put the right people into their lives. And if they act out or if they have experiences, allow them to experience those feelings and acknowledge their feelings. I can understand this is a hard time for you. That must be really difficult. So just being a support system.
Beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing with us about your books, about your own personal experiences with loss. So again, Andrea, thank you for being on the Shepherd's Pie today.
Thanks so much, Tony, for having me on. And if your readers would like to follow me, they can look at my website, www.andreabearauthor.com. And I've enjoyed it. And by the way, I'm just going to do a little shameless plug for you, Tony. My daughters especially my oldest one, she loves your books. So especially the Middle Ages.
That is wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I always love to hear, especially when we have teen girl readers. So thank you for the shameless plug, which I will shamelessly accept.
Anytime.
But that is all the time we have for the show today. We've been speaking with Andrea Bear about how to deal with grief and loss in your family. Again, this is Antony Barone Kolenc. If you have a question or a topic that you'd like me to cover on the show, please drop me a line on my website, antonykolenc.com. And that's where you could also learn more about my series, The Harwood Mysteries. Until next time, may God bless you and your families as we work together to raise faithful kids.